You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
Acura's all-new ADX, a compact SUV that isn't just built for one thing. It's precision-crafted for everything. To escape the grind with available all-wheel drive. To go with your flow with available Google built-in.
Hey Google, turn it up.
Okay, turning up the volume. And crafted to be heard with an available Bang & Olufsen premium sound system. The all-new Acura ADX, crafted to match your energy. Acura, precision-crafted performance.
Take your vibes and go, 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 go.
Google is a trademark of Google LLC.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 212, The Battle Before Britain Part 4, Leaves Upon the Wind. This week, a big thank you goes out to Joshua, Lee, Alex, and Bennett for choosing to support the podcast by becoming members. You can find out more about supporting the podcast over at historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members. The first 3 episodes of this series has been focused on technology and the strategy that was built around that technology. And this will be the 4th episode on that theme. Of course, we cannot complete a discussion of the technology and tactics that would be on display over France and Britain in 1940 without taking some time to discuss the aircraft that would be locked in combat in the skies. There were, of course, the 3 big fighters, the Bf-109, the Hurricane, and Spitfire. But there were also many other types of aircraft involved in the campaign, from German bombers like the He-111, the Do-17, and the Ju-88, to fighter concepts that would showcase the challenges of their designs, like the Bf-110 and the Defiant. History treats each of these aircraft differently, from the harsh evaluations of the heavy fighter concepts to what can only be described as the legendary and mythical position of the Spitfire, and sort of everything in between. Each of these aircraft would have their own stories, from their design and development to their performance in action. And so it is important to give an introduction to what will be some of the primary characters of the future episodes of this series. Before we dive too much into technical discussion, it's worth discussing a little on the front of tactics that would be used among the fighter squadrons of both the Luftwaffe and the Royal Air Force. These tactics and formations are important because they would provide the structure to at least the early fighting during the summer of 1940. Both air forces had formulated their aerial tactics based on the type of war they planned to fight, and their beliefs about how air combat should be approached and structured. Starting on the German side, the Luftwaffe built its fighter formations out of pairs of aircraft, and then 2 pairs of aircraft made up a swarm, and 4 aircraft of the swarm kept roughly 275 meters between each of them when they were flying in formation. That was always a rough number. Nobody was out there with laser distance sensors or anything, but they would kind of eyeball 275 meters. The reason for this spacing was that 275 meters was right around the turning radius of a Bf-109 when at high speed, which meant that there was theoretically a very low chance of any kind of collision, which was always good. There was also some altitude differences between the different aircraft, again just to provide better spacing. 3 Schwarm would then make up a Staffel, for a total of 12 aircraft. All of the aircraft in the Staffel would retain their same spacings, which would result in a total formation of the Staffel, which would cover about 2 kilometers in the sky. This was important because at this point in history, fighters did not have radar, and so it was completely up to simply their eyes to find enemy aircraft. Even the British pilots who were flying based off of information received from radar stations on the coast still had to find the German aircraft, and the German pilots had far less information about the British aircraft that they would face over Britain. The loose German formation allowed all the pilots to be involved in these visual inspections, just looking around, while also taking the time to follow each pilot's respective leader, all the way up to the leader of the Staffel. When enemy aircraft were found, the general idea for the Germans was that the lead aircraft would be the ones going for the kills, while their following aircraft, their wingmen, were responsible for protection and defense from enemy aircraft. This is one of the reasons that some of Germany's top aces would build up very high kill totals, because kills were funneled into them based on how the Luftwaffe structured its aerial tactics. The goal of the Staffel was also to help provide protection for the pilots, because the most important predictor of success in aerial combat at this time was experience. On the other side of these aerial engagements was the RAF. Before the war, the RAF took a different path for how to organize its fighters while they were in the air, primarily due to the fact that they believed they had a different mission than the Germans. The belief among the leaders of fighter command was that their primary purpose was to attack formations of enemy bombers, which was completely different than facing enemy fighters. It brought with it different requirements and constraints, which meant that the way to approach the combat was different. While attacking enemy bombers, British fighters could be assured that they would have the speed, maneuverability, and firepower advantage, and it gave the fighters freedom for how to approach any specific engagement. This resulted in an emphasis on set-piece attacks on bomber formations known as fighting area attacks. These scripted attacking formations and behaviors would be designed to give the British attacking squadrons a known plan for as many scenarios as possible. For example, if RAF fighters came upon a single enemy bomber, they were to arrange themselves in a line and attack in succession from behind the bomber, hopefully destroying the bomber quite quickly. Or, if they were able to approach a formation of bombers from behind, they would all try and stay behind the formation, shooting until they exhausted their ammunition, hopefully destroying several bombers in the process. There was then a whole list of other variations on all of these ideas, to try and provide a toolbox for how to deal with any situation. I don't think audio is a great way to describe them, so I won't go too much deeper into the details. The important part, though, is that this is how Fighter Command believed most of its fighters would be fighting the war, pursuing and attacking enemy bombers that were not being escorted by fighters. The Hurricane squadrons in particular were focused on these kinds of attacks and would spend the majority of their training time on mastering the various formations and actions described in the Fighting Area Tactics Guidelines. They also planned to use what was referred to as the Vic formation. This formation involved 3 aircraft being in very close proximity, with the section leader being in front and the other 2 aircraft following behind to the left and to the right, with one above and one below. If you've ever been to an air show or seen a picture of 3 aircraft together, you've probably seen them flying in a Vic formation, as it is perfect for getting really good photographs. It would prove to be far less good at being a combat formation. The challenge with the Vic formation is that the 3 aircraft were very close together, and this greatly increased the chances of an aerial collision, which was bad. The following aircraft, therefore, spent most of their time just trying to keep in position with the lead aircraft, instead of observing the skies around them. Along with some of the challenges involved in just trying to find the enemy, due to having 1 in 3 of the pilots actually focused on looking for enemy planes, the 3-fighter section also created numerical problems for the British fighters. In each 3-plane section, only the section leader was supposed to attack enemy aircraft, and the other 2 aircraft in the section were designated to defend and protect the section leader. This meant that only 1/3 of the British fighters would be actively engaging the enemy, compared to half for the German fighters with their 2-plane sections, where the section leader would be attacking and his wingman would be defending. The challenges posed by the British formations would become apparent when fighter squadrons met, with smaller German squadrons having an equal number of designated shooter aircraft. In the case of the fighting area attacks and the Vic formation, combat experience would prove that there were challenges involved in actually taking theory and putting it into practice, but there were some additional reasons that they were put into place. During the late 1930s, the RAF was expanding very rapidly, and there was a major concern that pilots would not have the training and experience to be able to have freedom in the skies. The concern was that the inexperienced pilots would not know what to do, or they would make critical mistakes that would cost aircraft and cost the lives of the pilots. Stricter formations and scripted actions were seen as a counter against inexperience. The goal was to limit the mistakes that inexperienced pilots could make by reducing the number of choices that they had to make while flying. In theory, this was not a bad idea, but they perhaps dialed things in a bit too much. This is perhaps best exemplified by what the Germans called the German Vic formations, which translates into rows of idiots. There was some recognition among RAF leadership, including Hugh Dowding, the head of RAF Fighter Command, that the tactics that were being taught were lagging behind the times. However, due to the rising fear of war in the late 1930s and the growing number of pilots that were entering into the RAF, Dowding and others felt that it was too late to rewrite the tactics that were being used, and that doing so would simply cause more confusion. In this evaluation, they were probably underestimating how flexible the pilots were, and how quickly they could have adapted to new systems and new challenges. For example, due to experience over France, some of the sections began to introduce small changes by themselves, like increasing the spacing between aircraft to make it easier to maneuver. Later alterations would also come into play, with one example of this adaptation being the introduction of a formation in which 3 sections flying in Vic formation were followed by another that would fly behind them and would weave back and forth to make it more difficult for German aircraft to attack from behind. There were also changes to how the British fighter squadrons attacked German bomber formations, with a greater emphasis on head-on attacks against bomber groups, with the higher closing speed making it more difficult for the bombers to react. The additional 2 benefits in this kind of attack from the front was that it resulted in more danger for the bomber formation leader, who was often in charge of navigation and dropping the bombs. It also often resulted in the bombers breaking formation because they had an aircraft flying at them at hundreds of miles an hour, so they had some incentive to move around a little bit. Attacks from the rear of German bomber groups was still the most common though, if only because it was safer due to the fact that the German bombers had fewer guns pointing in that direction. There were limits to how quickly the RAF pilots could evolve their tactics though, especially during the height of the fighting in the late summer of 1940. This was due to the simple fact that they were spending all of their energy and time flying, with multiple sorties per day being the norm for many of the squadrons stationed in southeast England. They also had to contend with the fact that replacement pilots, often fresh from their abbreviated flight training, only had a limited amount of experience and ability, so tactics could not stray too far from what they had been taught in school. While of course the fighter-on-fighter melees over Britain occupy most of the famous accounts of the Battle of Britain, the bombers were also the key target. The bombers that would feature so heavily in the fighting during the Battle of Britain were the German triumvirate of pre-war designs, the HE-111, the DO-17, and the Ju-88. They would be joined by the Stuka in some scenarios, although its tour of duty over England was limited due to its range and its vulnerability to British fighters. The 3 German medium bombers were solid bombing platforms though, and they would be the real workhorses of the Luftwaffe during this period of the war. Each of them were equipped with machine guns for defense, 2 of them featured armored plating, and they all had self-sealing fuel tanks, an important innovation that reduced the probability of the aircraft bursting into flames. They would also prove to be more difficult to destroy than the British expected. Before the war, British fighter development had focused on placing as many machine guns as possible on the fighters, with 8 machine guns being landed on as the ideal number, with each of those guns being a .303 caliber. The problem with this armament is that it did not provide very much hitting power, especially against some of the more heavily armored German aircraft, like the Ju-88. Most of the people listening to this podcast have probably seen pictures of Allied heavy bombers coming back from raids over Germany with tons of damage and bullet holes. The B-17 is like famous for this. And the same thing was happening to German bombers during the Battle of Britain. It was not uncommon for German bombers to arrive back at their airfields with 100 bullet holes, a testament both to their durability, but also to the fact that the British were probably not arming their fighters with what they needed if they wanted to shoot down German bombers. Fighter Command was not blind to this problem, and experiments had already happened where some of their machine guns were replaced by a 20mm cannon, which gave the British fighters a lot more firepower. However, there were challenges in keeping the cannons firing, and in fact 19 Squadron, one of the first to be given cannon-armed fighters, swapped with a training unit because they got tired of their cannons jamming while in flight. While the German bombers would prove to be more durable than the British expected, they did have their own challenges to deal with. One of these problems would be simply hitting a target, a problem that would be a major problem for all the bombing forces during the war. Due to the proliferation of anti-aircraft guns, bombers flew higher and faster over contested airspace, like the skies over Britain, than they planned to before the war, and this drastically reduced their ability to actually hit anything. It was estimated that at 4,000 meters in altitude, just 2% of the bombs dropped by an HE-111 fell within 200 meters of the target, so not exactly precision bombing, and that meant more sorties, and that meant more time over Britain, and that meant more time in danger of being shot down, either by anti-aircraft fire or by British fighters.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Commercial Insurance. Business owners, meet Progressive Insurance. They make it easy to get discounts on commercial auto insurance and find coverages to grow with your business. Quote in as little as 6 minutes at progressivecommercial.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company. Coverage provided and serviced by affiliated and third-party insurers. Discounts and coverage selections not available in all states or situations.
This episode is brought to you by Principles. Are there limits to the U.S. government's debt growth? What will happen if the debts are not curtailed? What should policymakers or investors do? Those are urgent questions that legendary investor and New York Times bestselling author Ray Dalio addresses in his new book, How Countries Go Broke: The Big Cycle. The book comes out in June and is available for pre-order today, wherever books are sold.
The other problem for the German bombers was the fact that they could not always be escorted by German fighters all the way to their destination, due to the limited range of the Bf-109. But this was a problem that the Germans had thought of before the war, and to try and fix the issue, they built the Bf-110. The Bf-110 was the pinnacle of the pre-war heavy fighter concept, which was based on the idea that if you could take a fighter and give it 2 engines, it would allow for more speed and a much greater range. Then those 2-engine heavy fighters could be used to escort bomber formations deep into enemy territory where single-engine fighters did not have the range. The Luftwaffe was not the only air force to request aircraft that met these heavy fighter requirements. For example, the British would also have a heavy fighter with the Blenheim 1F, which was based on the same concept. In theory, the idea was okay, bombers were safer with escorts, and the only way to get the range required was with a larger aircraft. But then the actual fighting started. While range was a fundamental benefit of the 2-engine fighter design, the trade-off was maneuverability. It was a larger, heavier aircraft, and therefore could be outturned by single-engine fighters like the Spitfire and Hurricane. Their lack of maneuverability was particularly noticeable anytime they had to roll, with their large engine-supporting wings creating a lot of resistance. There was basically nothing that a Bf-110 pilot could do to prevent an enemy fighter from getting behind them, which was not completely unexpected and was the reason that there was a machine gun mounted in the tail. But unfortunately for the pilots, it was found that one machine gun was not enough to deter an attack from behind. Because of these problems which would never be solved, and some early challenges during the campaign, the Bf-110 would be used less and less as an escort fighter throughout the course of the fighting over Britain, although it would become a more effective fighter-bomber, particularly against naval targets. This was a major reversal from the role that was imagined for the Bf-110 before the war, when the hope was that half of all fighter squadrons would be equipped with the Bf-110. The only reason that this did not happen actually by the summer of 1940 was due to the fact that engines could not be created fast enough, and obviously the heavy fighters required twice the number of engines of their single-engine counterparts. And so many of the squadrons that would have been equipped with Bf-110s were instead given Bf-109s, which was actually good for the Luftwaffe in the long run. The Bf-109 was the most famous and most produced German fighter of the Second World War, and in 1940 it can be claimed that it was the best fighter in the air. Just like other fighters during the Battle of Britain, it was a mid-1930s design that had been improved in the intervening years, especially after it received its first combat experiences in Spain. After the invasion of Poland, the Bf-109 had ruled the skies over Europe, with massive kill counts that were mostly due to it being simply better than the aircraft that it faced. And in some ways, that technical advantage would be maintained over Britain. During the summer of 1940, there were 3 key design differences between the Bf-109 and the British fighters, and those were fuel injection, a variable pitch propeller, and heavier armament. The fuel injection situation was interesting, and would be one of the most interesting design differences between the British and German fighters. The Bf-109's engine, the DB601, was fuel injected, and that meant that fuel was forcefully injected into the engine cylinders while the engine was running. The Spitfire and Hurricane instead used a float carburetor system, which was a simpler technology, but it had one very important downside. In a situation in which the aircraft was experiencing negative vertical G-forces, like when it was beginning a dive, the engine would cut out. Now, this was not a fatal flaw for the British fighters, and the engine would restart as soon as the G-forces changed, but in the moments where their engines did not work, the Bf-109 could often escape or move into a better position. The Bf-109, with its fuel injection, had none of those problems. The second major advantage that the Bf-109 had was the fact that they used an electric-controlled variable pitch propeller. This provided major performance benefits, particularly as the altitude at which fighting was occurring continued to climb during the early war years. A variable pitch propeller simply means that the angle on the propellers could change when required. So there would be one setting for takeoff when maximum thrust was required, and then another for a leisurely flight, and then maybe another for high altitude, high performance, etc., etc. It was variable. You could make it do whatever you needed it to do. This provided a more consistent performance profile at all altitudes, and it would be something that the British would quickly move to integrate into their own fighters. Both of these advantages, the fuel injection and the propeller, allowed the Bf-109 to get into position, at which point the heavier armament of the aircraft came into play. The British fighters famously had their 8 machine guns, 4 in each wing, while the 109 had 1 machine gun in each wing and then also a 20mm cannon in each wing. While the cannons were heavier, the machine guns on board could still be provided with about 3 times more rounds than the British machine guns had access to, which gave them a much longer total firing time with 1 combat load. Along with having more rounds per gun, the German machine guns also fired slower, which greatly reduced their theoretical maximum damage per second, but it only mattered if you hit something, and the German pilots would have far more opportunities to hit something. Also, the real damage potential from the 109 came from the cannons, which only had 60 rounds each, which gave the pilot only 7 seconds of firing time for the cannons. However, even a single hit with one of those cannon rounds could destroy a British aircraft. It was kind of a trade for volume, for hitting power, which would serve the Germans well at this stage of the war. While the 109 was a really good fighter, it was also piloted by some of Germany's best. Some of the German fighter pilots had years of combat experience under their belt by the summer of 1940, and incredibly successful experience at that, and that experience would be critical to getting the most out of their 109. There were many quirks to the aircraft that experienced pilots could take advantage of in combat. For example, the 109 had a relatively high stall speed, but it had good stall stability so that the pilot would not lose control. This meant that it was possible to do a purposeful stall which would cause a rapid loss in altitude, which could be a good thing in the right circumstances. But in inexperienced hands, it could be a disastrous mistake because it involved losing a lot of speed very quickly. A good pilot could use this to gain an advantage. Another would probably just get himself killed. While on one hand the Bf-109 had some technologies that the British fighters did not, on the opposite end of the spectrum of cool new technological things was the Hawker Hurricane. The Hurricane would be the most numerous British fighter during the Battle of Britain, equipping about 2/3 of all fighter command squadrons when the fighting started. It was a workhorse, but not exactly a thoroughbred. And that did not mean that it was useless, though. Sure, the Hurricane was slower than the 109, its armament was not as powerful, but in the right circumstances, it could get the job done. The good news for the RAF and the Hurricane pilots is that there were many German targets over Britain that were not 109s, specifically German bombers. This is why, whenever possible, Hurricane squadrons attempted to engage enemy bomber formations, while the German fighters were left to the Spitfires. This was not always possible, though, and when it was not possible, the key for the Hurricanes were to bring the fighting down to lower altitude. And due to different performance profiles, as the altitude got higher, the 109 gained a greater and greater advantage over the Hurricane. But below 20,000 feet or so, these differences were reduced. This was mostly thanks to the fact that the Hurricane could turn much quicker than the 109, which often meant that there were opportunities for the Hurricane at those lower altitudes. Now, of course, because of its slower speed, there was nothing that the Hurricane could do to prevent the German fighter from just running away. But that was not their goal. Their goal was to protect the bombers and destroy British fighters. So if the Hurricane could just stay alive and distract the 109s, that was at least some small victory. Hopefully some other squadron was taking care of the bombers. Over the course of the battle, the Hurricane would claim more aerial victories than the Spitfire, mostly due to the combined impact of having bombers as their primary target and the fact that there were just so many more Hurricanes. And since 1940, there have been many conversations about which British fighter was more important to the British victory, the higher performance Spitfire or the more numerous Hurricane. The official position of the podcast is that the Hurricane was the most important of the two British fighters, but it has nothing to do with performance or aerial victories. One of the benefits of the Hurricane was that it was a simple design, it was easy and quick to build, and this allowed it to enter service faster than the Spitfire during the 1930s, and allowed production to be ramped up at a higher rate. The British did not need the perfect fighter in 1940, they needed capable fighters, and the Hurricane was that capable fighter. It was more important to victory because it was boring, almost outdated, it was mundane, but there were a lot of them. And as much as people like to talk about the importance of technology, this podcast has talked about the importance of technologies, numbers still matter, and numbers are what the Hurricanes provided. While the Hurricane was an important part of fighter command, nobody should be under any illusion that the Spitfire was not the belle of the ball. I struggle to think of another example where a single piece of equipment is as tied to an event as the Spitfire is to the Battle of Britain. The roots of the Spitfire were in a 1935 Air Ministry specification named F-1035, which called for a fighter that could reach a speed of at least 310 miles an hour while carrying at least 6 machine guns. This was actually the same specification that would result in the Hurricane, but Hawker's fighter would enter into large production much quicker thanks to its simpler design and technology. The production of the Spitfire was far slower, and the first production Spitfire would not be delivered until May 1938. This put it well behind the original production schedule, and it would not seriously catch up with those expectations until the war years. But it was not for a lack of trying. Supermarine outsourced most of its production quite early on because it could not keep up with production, and then the Shadow Factory scheme provided greater production capacity, but it was still not enough. By the start of the war, there were only a few hundred in active service, a number that was originally scheduled to be reached years earlier. But production was ramping up in speed, just in time for the Spitfire to participate in its most famous action. In some ways, the Spitfire was better than the 109. In some ways, it was worse. And when those strengths and weaknesses were combined on both sides, it could be difficult to predict the outcome of a dogfight. Both the Hurricane and the Spitfire were very successful aircraft during the war, but that was not true for all of the participants in the Battle of Britain. Before the war, there were many competing theories on how best to participate in an air war, and these disagreements had a big impact on how aircraft were built. The discussions around strategic bombing were an important large-scale example of this. It completely shifted air strategy and doctrine. And there were countless other ideas that would result in certain aircraft being produced in the 1930s that would not prove to be very useful when the war started. The heavy fighter concepts that we discussed earlier with the Bf-110 are a good example of this. They were aircraft that were designed for an understandable reason, but which did not end up really working out due to the advances made in other aircraft types. Then there were other aircraft that were an entirely different concept, or an entirely different concept was used for their design, and their intended purpose would prove to be invalid once the war started. There are a few different examples of this that you could pull from here, but in this episode, we'll focus on the Boulton-Paul Defiant. The Defiant is a case where expectations and reality could not have been more different, because before the start of the war, there were conversations about the Defiant being the fighter of the future. And this was because instead of having forward-facing machine guns fixed on its wings, like the Hurricane or the Spitfire, it had 4 machine guns mounted in a manned, electrically powered turret behind the pilot. This allowed it to fire above, behind, and to the sides, but importantly, the aircraft did not have any guns firing forward. The theory was that this would make it easier to attack bombers, since it would be able to track and fire on targets for a longer period of time and from many different angles. These possibilities meant that the Defiant had its supporters before the war, with Churchill in particular being convinced that the Defiant concept was simply superior to fixed-gun fighters. But there were problems, serious problems, for the Defiant if it ever ran into enemy fighters. The biggest problem was the firing arcs and speed of traverse for the turret. The guns could not fire below the horizontal, and while this made it great when engaging bombers from below, there was nothing that could be done to protect from an enemy attack from below the Defiant. It was then often difficult to get the plane in the right position for the guns to be of any use against enemy fighters, and the positioning and maneuvering requirements were much less intuitive than a forward-firing fighter craft. It did not help that because there were two people in the aircraft, they had to communicate between the pilot and the gunner, and having to coordinate their actions to bring targets into the sights of the guns proved to just be really, really challenging. Honestly, positioning the aircraft to attack was a problem even against slower bombers. It became almost impossible against fighters, especially when they were moving as fast, if not faster, than the turret could traverse, which means that the gunner needed the assistance of the pilot to move the aircraft in the right direction. These problems would never be solved, and the best that could often be done would be for the Defiants to line up and execute a descending spiral formation so that the guns of one could cover the others from being attacked by fighters. Eventually, the Defiant would be withdrawn from daylight fighter service during the Battle of Britain entirely and shifted to a night fighting role, a role that it would maintain until the introduction of more dedicated night fighter aircraft into the RAF in 1942. Along with the aircraft models and designs, there are a whole host of other possible topics for discussion that would have a major impact on the overall course of the air war. Engine design, pilot training, machine gun and cannon development, survivability and safety, even small things like cockpit design. But one of those items that I will highlight is high-octane fuel. The quality of the fuel used at any given time during the war is not frequently discussed, and instead all discussions about fuel focus exclusively on quantity. This is for good reason. It doesn't matter what the quality of the fuel is if it does not exist. But when it came time to put fuel in particularly fighter aircraft, the octane value of the fuel did have an important impact on performance. The octane number, which is often displayed on fuel pumps at civilian fuel stations, is a rating of how high the pressure and the temperature can be on the fuel before it prematurely detonates in the engine. The goal is to avoid that premature detonation because it impacts the efficiency of the engine, but you also want as much pressure as possible in the engine because that increases engine power output. The British had access to 100 octane fuel provided by American firms and shipped over to Britain, while the Germans would have to work with 87 octane fuel, which is what they had access to, which is very similar to the common fuel found in fueling stations today. High-octane fuel would provide more power, but only before around 18,500 feet in altitude, because any higher and the air was not thick enough to push enough into the engine to make use of the higher octane. But those first, 18,000 feet were important because the more power at that level meant that the British fighters were faster at climbing off of their airfields. The exact impact this would have on climb rate was not always exactly the same, but it would save somewhere around 40 seconds for the initial climb of a Spitfire, allowing it to reach 20,000 feet in 7 minutes instead of over 7.5. This was not always important, but when it was very important. Having access to high-octane fuel did not change the outcome of the Battle of Britain, but it is an interesting example of how deep the rabbit hole can go when looking at how each side prepared for the fighting and the differences that could be found that may not have swung the battle one way or the other, but which might have nudged specific events one way or the other. While there are many topics that we could zoom in on like this, next episode we will zoom out a bit and instead focus on the pilots that would fly for the RAF Fighter Command during the Battle of Britain, and the man who would give them their collective name, the Few, in one of his most famous speeches, Winston Churchill.